Welcome to all of you on this rainy afternoon. Thanks for being here. Those who are here out of choice or those who are compelled, you are all welcome. And we're delighted with that this next international scene will feature very distinguished guests. But I also want to let you know about a couple of other upcoming events that are on the agenda and are also very exciting. One is October is going to be frenzy, which is a good frenzy, because we have a wide variety of events going on, as many of you know. October 14th is Indigenous Peoples Day, or when we celebrate it here. So there will be a wide array of events. So pay attention, may notice. I think that will also be a wonderful day of not only politics, but culture, history, and celebration. On October 30th, the next International Scene lecture will be with Ambassador Fergal Mithen. Isn't that a great name? He is the ambassador from the Republic of Ireland to the United Nations. As all of you know, right now, this week, the General Assembly at the UN is going on. You may have seen notifications of it or hit the bad traffic, but in any case, he will be fresh from that meeting and be able to, I think, share some absolutely current insights about some of the urgent issues of the day. Because it's the 80th anniversary of so many things this year, the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, the 80th anniversary of the bombing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and of course the 80th anniversary of the establishment of the UN. So we are particularly lucky to have him come and speak with us, not only about that history, not only about the urgent issues of the day, but hopefully to share some wisdom about the path forward. So please come to that. That's Thursday, the 30th, and it is at 2:40, same time slot. So please come to that and share in those insights, questions, and again, vision ahead. I know I'm forgetting several other things. The Day of Dialogue, the signature event of the Center for Civic Engagement, will be on October 21st. And as most of you know, hopefully, that is a smorgasbord of events, whether or not it is panels, presentations, talks, events, all kinds of things going on for that annual Day of Dialogue. And particularly important for students, hopefully, dialogue is the key here. And so hopefully you will come and not only learn, but share your own insights, your own questions about these absolutely urgent issues of the day. The world, and you look at the world and look at the United States, it's hard to not get discouraged. I constantly do my mantra of think pessimistically and realistically and face the reality, but hopefully act with optimism and some degree of hope for a better future. So in that spirit, we are delighted to welcome our guest today, who is Professor Peter Kuznick, who's he's a historian at American University in Washington, D.C. But that doesn't begin to talk about his many hats, his many talents. He's a very interdisciplinary person. Some of you may know his work with Oliver Stone, with whom he was a co-director on the film about the untold story of the U.S., of America, and his award-winning, best-selling book of the same name. He is, again, has vast experience, not only with this topic, where we're going to focus on surviving the new Cold War, prospects and policies and prospects, but also he is very committed to important issues of pedagogy. He's done a lot of study abroad programs, has taken his students to Japan, to Vietnam, to lots of places, as well as he's very committed to public education and does a wide array of interviews, public media, events throughout the world. So we are delighted that he is here. He's also going to tell you a little bit about the Nobel Peace Prize and his role in choosing the participants, or some of them. So in any case, please join me in welcoming Professor Kuznick. The format for the day is the usual one. We will hear from him for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have a reaction, a comment from our own wonderful Professor Carolyn Eisenberg, who will, and I see we have fans in the audience here.
Pay them.
And then we will open things up for your comments and questions. Make sure that they come from the 2 mics so that we can hear you and it's being recorded. So again, please join me in welcoming Peter Kuznick to Hofstra University.
Thanks, Linda, for that introduction. Thanks, Linda and Marty and Rusty, for inviting me. And thank all of you for turning out on this not so lovely afternoon. I should warn you first that I'm not good at 25 minutes. My classes at AU are 2.5-hour block classes. And I give them a 5-minute break in between, but I sometimes talk for 2.5 hours. So I don't know how to limit something to 25 minutes, but I'm going to do my best.
He's given me permission to throw something at him at times.
Not the water bottle.
Not the water bottle.
A spitball. But let me start with, there's so much to talk about in terms of the first Cold War and the current Cold War. But in order, so I'm an historian, so I have to put the new Cold War in a little bit of context. So I'm going to start with one of my favorite quotes about the old Cold War. Now, if you're in your late teens or early 20s, this seems like really ancient history to you. And you probably don't learn that much about the Cold War. But Arthur Schlesinger, who was on Linda's committee, was a great historian, or an interesting historian, who was active in the Kennedy administration. He was kind of their house historian. And he said, men and women a century from now will very likely find the Cold War as obscure and incomprehensible as we today find the 30 Years' War, the terrible conflict that devastated much of Europe not too long ago. Looking back at the 20th century, our descendants will very likely be astonished at the disproportion between the causes of the Cold War, which may well seem trivial, and the consequences, which could have meant the veritable end of history. And I think that was a very profound comment. Just as when we look back at Ukraine or Taiwan or Gaza 100 years from now, they're going to say, well, what was wrong with those people back in 2025 and those years, as we do now about the Cold War. But I know so the Cold War began, we can argue, 80 years ago or 78 years ago. Rusty is, Professor Eisenberg is a historian of the Cold War, and she can fill us in on some of it. But I gave my students, or these are college students, history students, an anonymous survey a few years ago. These were mostly A students in high school, and I asked them, how many Americans died in World War II? The median answer, do it in your heads, the median answer I got was 90,000, which means they were only off by 300,000. So they were at least in the ballpark on that. Then I asked them anonymously, how many Soviets died in World War II? The median answer I got was 100,000, which means that they were only off by 27 million, which means that they could not comprehend what the Cold War was about. They have no idea what Ukraine is about now. They have no idea what World War II is about. And to me, that was very, very troubling. When I began this project with Oliver Stone, we initially released it, the 12-part documentary film series that aired on Showtime and then on Netflix, and it was out all over the world. except for China. China didn't air it, but every place else aired it when it came out in 2012 and 2013. And the US issued a national report card in 2012. And the area in which American students, American high school seniors, came in last, the area in which they were the lowest, was not math and science. We know they can't do math and science. It was US history. Only 12% of high school seniors were judged to be proficient in US history. And even that was questionable, because only 2% could tell them what the Brown versus Board of Education decision was about, even though it was obvious from the way the question was posed. So that's the thing. American students learn very little, if any, history. And the American people learn very little, if any history. And that's very troubling. Zhou Enlai, the Chinese vice premier, once said, that's the charming thing about Americans. They have absolutely no historical memory. Well, George Santayana, the philosopher, said something that people know pretty well. He said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. But he also says something even more profound. A country without memory is a country of madmen. If you saw your president at the United Nations the other day, you would have to wonder, like the rest of the world did, who is this madman who's up there talking about escalators that broke down, being upset about the teleprompter, even though it was his videographer that turned off the escalator when he was on it, his people who were responsible for the teleprompter, but he's going off and insulting all these countries and just tooting his own horn and saying how great his administration is, and saying that climate change, global warming is a hoax. It's the biggest con job ever. I mean, that's your future. And unfortunately, that's our president right now. But the lack of knowledge of history is a serious problem. For example, when we think about World War II, American students learn that the US won the war in Europe. The American people, in survey after survey, says the US won the war in Europe. Nonsense. The Soviets, throughout most of the war, the US and the British were confronting 10 German divisions between us, while the Soviets were confronting 200 German divisions. 6 out of every 7 Germans killed were killed on the Eastern Front. 1 out of every 7 killed on the Western Front. The US lost about 300,000 in combat, 400,000 overall. The Soviets lost 27 million. We don't know how many the Chinese lost at Japanese hands. But also, one of the things that I talk a lot about is Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I took students on a study abroad class to Hiroshima and Nagasaki every summer for more than 25 years. You know, I write a lot about it. And Americans don't know any of the history of this. They live with the myth that, again, the atomic bombs ended the war. And that's a tertiary factor in what ended the war. But in terms of who won the war in Europe, just very briefly, because I don't have a lot of time, in 1945, 57% of the French said that the Soviets won the war. The Soviets deserved the lion's share of credit for winning the war in Europe. You know what that figure is now? 7%. 57% in 1945, 7% today. Across all of Europe, 13% of the public gives the Soviets credit for playing a major role in defeating the Nazis. So we have a real problem with knowing history, with studying history, with using history. We've got a president who's very anti-intellectual, doesn't know history, and we're at a crucial moment in global history today, which is why it's so important to discuss these topics. We've got 2 major wars raging at the moment. The nuclear threats are proliferating as more and more countries consider developing nuclear weapons. We've got additional war threats over Taiwan, the South China Sea, Iran, Pakistan, between India and Pakistan. We've got the Trump presidency, which I'm not sure what form of fascism it represents, but it's pretty terrifying if you believe in the Constitution and if you admire democracy. It's something that you'll be able to study maybe 100 years from now, and I'm not sure how much you're going to get to live through it any longer. And we've got the threat to American democracy. We've got plutocrats and oligarchs and tech billionaires buying up the media, buying up bigger and bigger mergers. You've got the Congress that doesn't have a backbone, a Supreme Court that's missing in action. So it's a very dangerous moment. We've got troops on US streets like we've never seen. I mentioned to a seminar I spoke to before, Trump putting troops on the streets of Washington, D.C., the National Guard. Do you know what percentage of the vote, the presidential vote, Trump got in 2016 in Washington, D.C.? 4%. In 2024, he got 6%. Washington's an obvious target for him, a majority-minority city, the kind that he loves to hate. So these attacks on free speech that are going on now, you saw the Jimmy Kimmel thing recently. Not that there was free speech before, but there's less and less free speech now. I, for example, probably this year I'll do between 400 and 500 television interviews around the world. Mainstream media, prime time, all over the world. I did 2 this morning and got asked to do 2 more. But do I get on mainstream media in the United States? Did Howard Zinn? Did Noam Chomsky? Did Rusty? No. If you don't speak in the language that they approve, you don't get access to the media here. So even before this latest outrage, we had a very weak sense of democracy. And now we have the cowardly leaders of the universities caving in, the law firms, the television networks, businesses. This is not the country that I grew up in, and it's not the country I want to leave to you folks. Trade wars that are going on. There's a 19th century word, kakistocracy. It means government by the worst people. You look at who's in this administration. What a clown show. Pete Hegseth, half of his body covered with neo-Nazi tattoos. Robert Kennedy with the brainworm. Kash Patel, Pam Bondi, Kristi Noem, Brendan Carr with the FCC, Stephen Miller, Tom Homan. Where did you ever see an administration with this kind of people in the top positions? We've never seen that quite like this before. So the Cold War, I'll just talk briefly about it. The Cold War should never have happened. In fact, the last cable that Franklin Roosevelt sent to Winston Churchill, right before he died, he said, these issues between us and the Soviets come up all the time, and they all get resolved and work out. We should not jump to judgment, rush to judgment, and make a big issue out of it. Had Roosevelt lived, or had his vice president from 1941 to 1945 gotten the nomination instead of Harry Truman, we would have had a different history. Does anybody know who was vice president between 1941 and 1945? Yeah.
Henry Wallace.
Thank you. Yes, Henry Wallace, a name that's been lost to history. Roosevelt chose Wallace as vice president in 1940 as being on the ticket, even though the party bosses didn't want to put him on the ticket because Wallace was the leading anti-fascist, and Roosevelt knew we were going to fight a war against fascism. Roosevelt threatened not to run if the Democratic Party didn't put Wallace on the ticket. He wrote a letter to the convention turning down the nomination. Fortunately, they recanted and put Wallace on the ticket. In 1941, Henry Luce, the head of the Time Life empire, made his speech saying the 20th century, and wrote his editorial, the 20th century is going to be the American century. The U.S. is going to dominate the world in every way. Well, Wallace, as vice president, countered that. And he made a speech saying the 20th century should not be the American century, it should be the century of the common man. And he called for a worldwide people's revolution in the tradition of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the German Revolution, the Latin American revolutions, and the Russian Revolution. And he called for ending monopolies and cartels, ending imperialism, increasing food production globally, sending American science technology around the world. That's who Wallace was, the century of the common man. And on the day the Democratic Convention started, in 1944, July 20th, 1944, Gallup released a poll asking potential voters who they wanted on the ticket as vice president. 65% of American voters said they wanted Wallace back as vice president. 2% said they wanted Harry Truman. Do the math. You know, it's not even close, right? But the party bosses controlled the convention, and they made sure that Truman was put on there as vice president. Had Wallace been on the ticket again as vice president, and for 82 days before Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, Oliver Stone and I argue there would have been no atomic bombings in World War II and probably no Cold War. But we didn't have Wallace, and Roosevelt died, and you had Harry Truman. We can go into that history later. So the Cold War, we're lucky to have survived it. We're just lucky to have survived the Cold War. It went on until 1990, 1991. There were so many close calls. The one you probably know most about is the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that was terrifying. And it was terrifying because of what we didn't know. I did an event in the Vatican for the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 2022 with Jeff Sachs and Kerry Kennedy. Kerry Kennedy is Robert Kennedy's kids. And what happened there was that John Kennedy was frequently the only one in the room who didn't want to bomb the missile sites in Cuba and invade. He stood up repeatedly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and to all of his other advisors. If you read Robert Kennedy's book, 13 Days, then you think that Robert Kennedy was there by his side. Unfortunately, that wasn't true. Robert Kennedy often sided with the ones who wanted to go in there. And at one point, after the Joint Chiefs of Staff was berating him, John Kennedy said, they've got, those brass hats have one great advantage over us. If we do what they want and go in there, there'll be nobody left alive to tell them they were wrong afterwards. And that was the reality. Among the things we didn't know, so we assumed that, there were 10,000 armed Soviets in Cuba and 100,000 armed Cubans. Based on that, we thought we'd have 18,000 casualties and 2,500 dead, was what McNamara estimated. Then they found out that there were not 10,000 armed Soviets, there were 42,000 armed Soviets. There were not 100,000 armed Cubans, there were 270,000 armed Cubans. Then McNamara said, well, we would have lost 25,000 people if we had invaded. Then 30 years afterwards, McNamara was told for the first time at a conference that the Russians had also put 100 battlefield nuclear weapons into Cuba. McNamara turned white, and he said, in that case, we would have lost 100,000 men. We would have definitely wiped out Cuba and almost certainly wiped out the Soviet Union. So, that's how close we came to not being here now. Hofstra would not be here. Washington wouldn't be here had we done that. But we go in there, we'd only identified 33 of the 42 rocket sites there. We didn't know what we were doing, but that's the same thing over and over again in our history. There's so much to talk about in that regard, but a couple lessons from the Cold War. Number one is the question of threat inflation. How do you get the American people or the Russian people or the Chinese or the Germans to spend so much money on their militaries? For example, Trump takes credit for now NATO used to not reach 2% of GDP spent on their military. Now they're committed to 5%. Trump wants them to spend 10% of their GDP. How do you get people? In 1953, Eisenhower made a great speech, one of the great presidential speeches. And he said, so on March 5th of 1953, Stalin died. The Soviet leaders immediately extend an olive branch to the United States, effectively saying, let's end the Cold War. Eisenhower, newly elected, didn't say anything for 6 weeks. Then he made a speech, and it was a great speech. And he says, for every dollar that's spent on bombers, on jet planes, on tanks, on ammunition is a theft. It's a dollar that's stolen for what people really need, which is housing, which is food, which is education. It's new schools. It was a great speech. Unfortunately, 2 days later, Dulles, John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, undermines the whole thing and accuses the Soviets of trying to take over the world. So it didn't last very long, but we had 2 days when we could have ended the Cold War in 1953, even though we shouldn't have started it in 1945. We'll have a lot more opportunities to do that. But you have to scare people. So one of the first big scares was about the Soviets, and they introduced NSC 68. So NSC 68 called for a quadrupling of US military spending in 1950. And so instead of saying what the world we face is and what the likely scenarios are, it talked about the worst possible case scenario. If the Soviets were totally malign and out to destroy the world, this is what they could do. So we've got to do that. But nobody paid any attention to NSC 68 initially. Then the Korean War started, and the Korean War went on for 3 years, and a lot of people were killed. Mostly Koreans and Chinese, but also 36,000 or so Americans died in that. And after that, Churchill made an interesting remark. He said, I don't give a damn about Korea. I'd never even heard of the place till I was 74 years old. But the importance of Korea is that it led to the rearming of the United States. And then we adopted NSC 68, and our military budget shot up to $50 billion, which is nothing now, but it quadrupled overnight as a result. But we do this over and over again in terms of threat inflation. What do you keep hearing about Ukraine? First of all, you hear that it's a full-fledged invasion, myth number one. And not too far off because it's turned into a full-fledged invasion. Number two is that Ukraine can claw back all the territory that it lost, which is what Trump said 2 days ago. After Trump had been saying they're never going to get back that territory, now he says they could get it back. Nonsense, idiocy. That's never going to happen. Number three, they say that if Russia prevails in Ukraine, they're going to then gobble up one piece of Europe after another. Really? The Russians can't even, after 3.5 years, defeat Ukraine? And they're going to want to go to war against NATO? Putin might be a jerk in a lot of ways, but he's not a fool. He's not an idiot. He's not self-destructive. And that was the one good thing. So I did an interview this morning on Indian TV and an interview on Russian TV. And they wanted to talk about these things. So I said, the one lesson to take from what Trump said that Russia is a paper tiger, that Russia never wins any wars. He said, Ukraine could, if the Europeans provide arms to Ukraine, they can take back everything that they've lost. Well, the part of that I think is important for us to focus on is that Russia is not so powerful. It's taken them 3.5 years to get 20% of Ukraine. Does anybody really think that they're going to want to go to war with NATO? I've been saying for 3.5 years that that's idiocy, but that's what everybody who wants to scare their people into spending money on their militaries instead of their housing and their food and their schools and the things they need and transportation. For example, Jimmy Carter, one of America's better presidents after he's out of office. America's best ex-president. The only one who can possibly compete with him was John Quincy Adams. Because John Quincy Adams went back into Congress after being president and fought against slavery, led the fight against slavery. So Carter was a great ex-president, lousy president, unfortunately. And I blame Brzezinski on that. I'll just tell you one quick story. If you read Brzezinski was a national security advisor. He was Polish. He said that he was the first Pole in 300 years to stick it to the Russians. He liked to do that. And we can talk about some of that after. But Brzezinski insisted on giving the president's daily brief to Carter by himself. It had always been done by a top CIA official. But Brzezinski did it. And then he would also then lecture Carter afterwards and work with him. And he said, after a couple months, I heard my words coming out of Carter's mouth. And he says this explicitly in his memoirs. And Carter goes from being anti-war to being a real hawk, the last 2 years especially. He even reversed himself on Vietnam, as you know. So I'm talking about threat inflation. That's one of the lessons that we learned from the Cold War. Don't let them scare you into giving away your resources for the military. The number two is, so threat inflation, and the other two is false historical analogies. In one of my big classes, we had 150 students, I think, in it, I invited Robert McNamara to come in. Now, Robert McNamara might not mean much to you, but he means a lot to us because he was the Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War. He's often considered the architect of the Vietnam War. So I invited him to come into class, and he came along with Paul Warnke, who was the counsel for the Defense Department. And they both made an argument that one of the reasons the US got involved in Vietnam is because of false historical reasoning, that all the top policymakers used the Munich analogy. And the Munich analogy, which you've heard, you might not know it as the Munich analogy, says that if you don't stand up to a bully, to a tyrant like Hitler, if you accommodate him, if you acquiesce, he's going to take that and he's going to keep going. So they offered them Sudetenland, part of Czechoslovakia. And then he didn't stop, and he kept going. And they said they thought the same thing about the Vietnam, that the communists are going to win in Vietnam, and they're going to take all of Asia. There's also the domino theory during the Eisenhower years. And it was obviously not true, but we hear that same reasoning now in terms of Russia and China. And so those are the two major threats. How are we doing on time?
10 minutes? Yeah.
10 minutes to go?
Yeah.
Let me just talk a little bit about, because there's so much that I would like to talk about. In terms of Ukraine, we have to go back to 1990. In 1990, when the Cold War was ending, the United States asked Gorbachev. Now, I like Gorbachev. He gave Oliver Stone and me our first blurb for Untold History. And I think he's one of the heroes of the 20th century. So in Gorbachev, in negotiations with George H.W. Bush, with Baker, with Genscher, with Kohl, with the leaders of Germany, Britain, and the United States, agreed to allow NATO, agreed to allow unification of Germany, and the US promised him, and so did the Brits and the Germans, that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east, 1 thumb's width to the east. That was in 1990. Before the year was out, they were already talking about plans to expand NATO. They held it off till 1998. Then they expanded to Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary in 1998. But Russia was very weak after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So even though Yeltsin protested, and America's top diplomats, George Kennan, Paul Nitze, and others warned the U.S. that this is going to lead potentially to war with Russia, the U.S. went ahead and did it because we could. Then during the early 2000s, we keep on expanding. And then in 2007, Putin denounces United States unipolarity and hegemony. And then in 2008, George W. Bush says we need to fast-track Ukraine and Georgia into NATO in 2008. And at that point, the U.S. ambassador to Russia was William Burns. You know William Burns as the previous director of the CIA under Biden. Burns writes a memo back to the White House titled, "Niet means niet. Don't cross Russia's red lines," he says. The top experts all knew that this was going to provoke a war. Brzezinski wrote, so the former national security advisor, wrote in his 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard, that Russia can never become a great empire again, never become a Eurasian power, if we can make sure that it doesn't stay united with Ukraine. That was the logic. Divide Russia and Ukraine, and you can prevent Russia from ever becoming a major force in terms of world geopolitics or military again. That was also the message from Hadley, Libby, Feith, and other of the neocons in the George W. Bush administration, that Ukraine is key to limiting Russia. And so we called for the expansion of NATO into Ukraine. At that point, most Ukrainians did not want to join NATO. More of them were opposed than supported it. And then in 2014 or 2013, we've got the Maidan uprising. The Maidan uprising was very important because you had a popular, democratically elected president, Yanukovych, who was in office, had just made a deal with 3 European nations to hold new elections to unite the country. And before they could do that, there was a coup in Ukraine, funded in part by the United States, cheered on by Victoria Nuland, who was one of the top US diplomats, and Joe Biden, who had more ties to Ukraine than any other US politician. They overthrew the Russia-friendly government and imposed a Russia-hostile government. The Financial Times, a conservative London publication, said, we've been working on this for 2 years, and now we finally wrested Ukraine from the Russian orbit. So that was the beginning of things. Then the coup in 2014, and Russia responded by taking Crimea and supporting the liberation movements in the Donbass, in Luhansk and Donetsk. And then that's going to lead eventually to the Russian invasion in February of 2022, the invasion of Ukraine, that we can talk a lot more about, but I'm going to run out of time.
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. But that's number one. It's wrong for Putin to have invaded. In the nuclear age, war is outmoded. War is too dangerous in the nuclear age. We can't have these invasions. And so China and Brazil issued a 12-point peace plan about Ukraine. Point number 1 was defending national sovereignty, which was a critique of Russia for invading sovereign Ukraine. Point number 2 was that no nation's security should be achieved at the expense of any other nation's security, which is a critique of the US and NATO. Because by expanding NATO to Russia's doorstep, putting in advanced weaponry, doing all that training, arming it to the teeth, then they were hurting Russia's security. In the same sense, we often say, if China took over in Mexico or Canada, how would the US feel about that? And turned it into an armed camp. We wouldn't like that any more than the Russians like what happened there. But the other and real threat, so Pete Hegseth, the neo-Nazi, he's got tattoos all over his body. Pete Hegseth said that we have to end the war in Ukraine so we can go after the real enemy, China. And that's the one that they really targeted. That's who, back in October of 2011, Hillary Clinton wrote an article in Foreign Policy magazine titled America's Pacific Century, and said that the 21st century, the United States is going to dominate Asia. We're going to pivot our troops from Europe and the Middle East to Asia, and we're going to take on our main enemy, China. Well, if I had time, I'd talk about where this thinking comes from. People like Andrew Marshall, Andrew Krapinovich, Michael Pillsbury, all these China hawks who've been talking about the Chinese threat ever since the Soviet Union ended. And in 2008, they've been screaming about this. They said in 2008, everybody was listening to us all of a sudden. And now they believe that China represents this dangerous threat. And China clearly is the emerging power in the world, and militarily, but more economically, representing a threat to the US. In fact, in 2018, Mattis, Secretary of Defense, issued a new security guidance saying that the threat to American security no longer comes from global terrorism. It comes primarily from Russia and China is the pacing threat. So we saw first under the Obama administration, then under Trump's first administration, where he has trade war against China, putting tariffs on $247 billion of Chinese imports and threatening another $250 billion. And then we thought that when Biden came in, he was going to reverse that policy. It didn't happen. Biden came to office with 18 top advisors from the Center for a New American Security. Those are the China hawks. So the Biden doubled down on it and made things worse. And now Trump comes back, and you see what's going on with his trade war craziness. But the thing about Trump is that he's so stupid. So the U.S. way of containing China was to have these alliances. AUKUS with Australia, the U.S., and the U.K. JACUS with the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. The Quad with India and Japan. But what does the United States do? We need India as crucial to defending Taiwan, we think. So what does Trump do? He puts a 50% tariff on India. I go on these Indian TV shows all the time, and they hate the United States. They can't, as much as critical as I am of Trump, they're more critical. They're visceral. They despise him. Then the $100,000 for an H-1B visa, 70% of the H-1B visa holders in the U.S. are from India. So they are apoplectic in their hatred. But Trump does that. You know, he's such a small... But he goes on there, if you saw him at the UN, bragging about how he's the greatest president, or the greatest economy, and, you know, the United States has never been like this, and, you know, he just goes on with such nonsense. Everybody laughs at him, but they know that he's got power, and he's doing very, very dangerous things right now. Which gets me to the nuclear question. I'm going to finish up on the nuclear threats. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists issues the doomsday clock. They began that in 1947. And this year, in January, they moved the hands of the doomsday clock. This is about the threat of nuclear annihilation, from 90 seconds before midnight to 89 seconds before midnight. They only moved it 1 second. So I was recently talking to John Mecklin, who's the editor of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And I said, why did you only move it 1 second? Well, he said, we moved it to 89. Some people wanted to move it to 88, but that's the international symbol for Heil Hitler. So he couldn't move it to 88. I said, why didn't you move it to 60, which is more realistic? And he said, well, there were some people who argued for that, but we had some conservatives on the board of experts who didn't want to do that. You look at the situation. In 2023, General Mike Minihan, one of the top generals in the Pacific, said that he thinks that the U.S. and China are going to be at war by 2025. The head of the House Foreign Relations Committee said, I think he's right, 2025. In 2021, Admiral Davidson, who was in charge of the command there, said that he thinks that China is going to take Taiwan by force by 2027. So the 2027 date, we keep on hearing repeated, and nobody knows where he got that from. Xi Jinping said, I never said that. We don't have any plans to take Taiwan by 2027, but it gets worse. August 20th, 2024, there were two crucial articles. One, front page of the New York Times by David Sanger, the national security expert. David Sanger said that the U.S. is planning to fight a simultaneous three-front nuclear war against Russia, China, and North Korea. We're planning that. That's what our plan is. That same day, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists had an article saying that there are two groups of nuclear experts. One says we should rely on deterrence theory. The other says, forget it. We have the capability now of attacking the Russians and the Chinese, a stealth attack, and wiping out their capacity to retaliate. He said there is a group of top advisors in the Pentagon and the State Department who think we can and should preemptively, surprisingly, attack Russia and China. And the reason they said was that in the past, we have a nuclear triad. So we've got bombers, we've got intercontinental ballistic missiles, and we've got submarine nuclear weapons. We know how to wipe out the missiles. Maybe we could shoot down the bombers, but the stable part of the triad was always the submarines. But they said now with these new advances in sonar and other technology and AI, we can actually pinpoint and target all the Russian and Chinese submarines and wipe them out before they have a chance to retaliate against the United States. Read it in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, April 20th, 2024. And since then, we had General Thomas Buchanan write and say that the U.S. can fight and win a three-front nuclear war simultaneously against Russia, China, and North Korea, and still keep enough nuclear weapons in reserve that we can still dominate the world after that war is fought and won. This is the kind of people who we've got there. These are madmen. And Donald Trump, you know, to his credit, and I did some interviews on this, but Putin, pumped during his first term, destroyed the entire nuclear architecture. The INF Treaty, the New Skies Treaty, we previously got out of the ABM Treaty. The only thing that was left was the New START Treaty. And that was set to expire on February 5th, 2017. And Trump did not extend it, even though Putin asked him to in their first conversation. I mean, Trump's nuclear policies during his first term were pretty frightening. When he found out that we dramatically decreased the number of nuclear weapons in the world from the peak of 70,000 nuclear weapons in 1986 down to about 15,000, Trump said we should increase America's nuclear arsenal tenfold. It's at that point that Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, called him a fucking moron, you know, which was a compliment. But this was first-term Trump. But Trump recently has said we've got 10 times more nuclear weapons than we need. We should be cutting back on them. And Putin just said we need to extend the New START Treaty. So I'm optimistic that maybe Trump will do that. You know, it's possible that he could sometimes, you know, he could do the right thing. He's unorthodox, to say the least. But we're at a very, very dangerous juncture, whether it's over Ukraine, over Taiwan, over the South China Sea. We're planning for war. We're planning for nuclear war. We're planning for World War III. And so I'm not proud to bequeath this world to you. Our generation did a lousy job, unfortunately. But the other generations since are not doing it either. But you guys have got, this is the world you're inheriting. And it's a world that's changing. You just saw the meeting of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that took place in Tianjin, China. And what happened there was the world was united. We've got the BRICS countries now uniting. We've got the Global South that refuses to go along with the sanctions against Russia, not because they like the invasion, but because they say the U.S. is so hypocritical to be calling on the world to sanction Russia. Look at what the U.S. has been doing for the last 80 years all over the planet. And so, but this meeting, so what I've been calling for, among other things, is for Russia and for China and India to have a rapprochement, because there's a lot of hostility between them. And what we saw in Beijing and in Tianjin was Modi and Putin holding hands and meeting with Xi Jinping. There's a world that's changing. The US and Europe might not be part of that. Europe, for example, that's so desperate to fight against Russia over Ukraine, Europe used to represent 30% of global GDP. Now they represent under 14% of global GDP, and it's going down. You know, the future is Asia, the future is Africa, Latin America, and the US could be part of that, but we're going to have to fight like hell to make that happen, because given the instincts of the people in charge, that's not the direction they're going. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Peter. That's so extensive, a bit depressing, of course, but so important that we all understand this history and sort of challenge some of the myths and some of the amnesia that has characterized particularly America. So we're so grateful to hear now from Professor Carolyn Eisenberg, who is our resident treasurer, whose expertise is vast also, but focused on the Cold War and the Vietnam era. So I'll ask her to make some quick comments, and then we'll open things up for your questions and comments.
You know, I want to just say where I'm going to end up with these comments, which I promise are going to be brief, which is a question to Peter which is you've laid out so many depressing circumstances, and I'm thinking of what is it like listening to this? And so my question, which I'll conclude with, is also, what role is there for people to play? How do you respond to these things? What is there to be done? Because I think it's listening to this. I'm going to come back to it, so don't answer it yet.
But let me just interrupt to say, Rusty has the answer to that in her new book about Vietnam. She knows the answer to that question.
But that was Vietnam, and we're in a very difficult time. But we really are. But my question to Peter is actually really, what is hopeful? What constructive thing can people do? And that's not a simple matter. And I also think that some of what's going on now is so dismal that people are tuning out. Peter was saying in his remarks about the Trump's appearance at the UN. And I asked my class, not the people that are here, but first thing this morning, I asked my class of 30, how many people had seen what Trump said at the UN? And almost nobody had. And so I think, and I think that itself is very telling, because I feel in some ways that people just want to shut down. And I don't think it's just young people. I think it's older people too. That as the news gets really worse and worse, people just want to screen things out and do other things. And I actually said this as a person that can no longer watch the evening news because it's very distressing, even though I teach foreign policy. But I want to come back to the question of what role can people play that's actually constructive. I also, when Peter started talking about the early Cold War, one of the things I was thinking about was when I first started teaching, so this says how old I am, is when I first started teaching, the Cold War was going on. It was happening. So everybody in my class understood something about the Cold War, right? And, there was a lot taken for granted because it was still in process. And in my other class this morning, we were talking about the early Cold War, and it was clear that people just don't know much about it, right? And that I was trying to teach about the early Cold War in a week, in maybe 3 class sessions, and I actually thought that I wasn't doing a very good job because it's so complicated, and if people don't know about it in the first place, it's actually hard to get your hands around it. We're not talking about something that's very simple. But I do want to just say a couple of things about the early Cold War and how it sort of relates to where we are now. For a long time, while the Cold War was developing and going on, there was a kind of orthodoxy about the Cold War. There was an interpretation which just about everybody had, or at least anybody whose voice you could hear, and that was a very simple interpretation. Which was, we have a Cold War because the Russians want to take over the world, and we in the United States don't want to be taken over, and so we've had to engage and build up our military and so forth. That's the story. That's what the Cold War is about. Russia taking over the world. It's like Hitler. He wanted to take over the world. And so that was kind of a standard view. And I even remember, elementary school, we'd get these, weekly readers, and it would show you, the red on the map, and that was, a sign of threat. That the Russians were just expanding. And part of the reason for this orthodoxy, and I have a group of students here who are already my favorites, and who were studying McCarthyism, right? And that's relevant to this because for a very long time there was a real high price paid for saying anything different, that it was really scary. If you were a professor and wanted to say the Cold War isn't just about Russia taking over the world, and that the U.S. is doing a lot of things that are very problematic, you might be very quickly out of a job. Or if you were writing a book that was saying that it wasn't all Russia, again, you might not get a publisher. You wouldn't get one that easily. So that whole McCarthy period, that orthodoxy actually cramped research and academic inquiry. By the middle 60s, that had changed. And you suddenly, historians could actually look at what went wrong. How did we end up in this conflict with the Soviet Union? How did we get to a place where we could be blowing up the world, right? And suddenly those questions became real, and there was a lot of research that came out by many different historians that began to clarify that at least some part of the crisis that the world was in was not just because Russia was out to take over the world, and actually maybe it wasn't out to do that, but that U.S. policy played a very important role, and that to some particular degree, the very heavy reliance on military power, the largest army, the best weapons, the biggest nuclear stockpile, all those things that were sort of taken for granted, that to some degree that American militarism was actually part of what was keeping this conflict going and was part of what was making it so dangerous. So there was a lot of research that showed those things and at least revealed the complexity of why there was a conflict and revealed the complexity of relying too heavily on military strength and military intervention. But now we're back in a different period again. And one of the things I'm struck by is that now that old orthodox view of Cold War I is back. That you see more things being said that were like things that were said in 1957. Oh, at Yalta, that Roosevelt gave Europe, half of Europe to Stalin. I've just read that now 3 times. It's nonsense. It's not what happened with Yalta at all. But these Cold War truths have come back and sort of got a grip on imagination, even for people who don't know anything. Well, what we know is Russia tried to take over the world before. We stopped them, and that was good. But now we have to do it again, and because we can now repeat a success that we had before. And that structure has really seized the popular imagination. And it's made it very difficult for people to actually think in some alternate way, right? Because yes, if you think Russia just wants to take over the world, if that's Putin gets up in the morning and thinks of what country he can ruin today, then that's all you do, make more nuclear weapons. But it isn't that simple, and our talk today can't settle these questions, but it's to say that there's a really urgent need to re-examine some of that. And in particular, I think there's an urgent need to re-examine U.S. militarism, the extent to which our military budget is totally controlled now by $1 trillion worth of military spending, and we're going to cut people's health care. So I'm not really answering that question, but I do want to say that some of that Cold War orthodoxy and Cold War I is actually contaminating our ability to think more creatively and perhaps more accurately about what the crises are that we face now. So I want to stop and then make Peter explain what constructive things can people do. Let's see.
Or could we maybe take a few questions and then Peter can sum up by giving us some guidance on what is to be done. If questions, you should use the mic if you have questions or comments that you want to share. There's one there. There's one on the other side as well. So delighted to hear what you have to say.
I was paying attention to your comment on how the military budget, there was a plan to quadruple the military budget. Besides a fear of other countries invading the U.S., is there any other benefit to people, specifically in power, in expanding the military budget and, say, taking money away from healthcare? How does investing in military and specifically giving arms to the government of Israel or to Ukraine, how does that benefit how do leaders think that's going to benefit America or the economic state of America? And why are they willing to trade that for healthcare?
Great question. Bringing in the economics of all of this, I think, is really key. Do you want to respond to that, Peter?
Unless you want more questions.
Yeah, more questions first, and then we'll gather it up. Don't be shy. Great.
All right, this is a question for, I can't remember your name exactly, but Dr. Kuznick, I think.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But I wrote this down in my book. why wasn't the domino theory true? Because I remember you saying that at one point, but that was just a one-off thing. But I was thinking like, the U.S. was imperialist, but the Soviet Union also was imperialist. Both of them were trying to expand. I feel like, I'm not saying like whether it was right or wrong, but as the U.S. from their point of view, it would have made sense to stop an enemy's expansion of their ideology. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Really good question.
Anybody else before we go back? Please, yeah, but use the mic, please.
Hi, this is a question for Peter. So, I'm a current grad student here right now, but I just finished my undergrad at actually Washington D.C., not at AU, but at George Washington. So, I just want to ask, like, what I've been seeing on people's Instagram stories and across the news, that all over Foggy Bottom, which is the campus I was for the last 4 years, that the National Guard has been all over campus. How has that been at AU compared to Foggy Bottom and other parts of the city?
Okay. Other questions, comments, concerns,
Criticism.
criticisms, protests? All of the above. Great.
Thank you so much. I'm curious in thinking about this moment of new Cold War, so to speak. How might you imagine, or how do you think about the role of extreme weather events? So the increases of natural hazard events, especially things like hurricanes, and how that could play a role one way or another in our thinking about this new Cold War.
Great. And for those of you who don't know, this is our new faculty member who is an expert in disaster issues. So, and we certainly are experiencing disaster issues of all sorts. So thank you, Ruth. Yes.
All right. Thank you. I wanted to ask, I heard you said criticizing Trump's like wanting a European country to increase their spending for NATO. But the truth is that Putin will not stop at Ukraine. That's a thing. And how can we like continue like this without like increasing the share of European countries? That's just the truth. You can't with someone with Putin in the like at the border of Europe. You cannot like say, oh, we're going to decrease spending for military. So we know who is Putin, and how can we like put those two informations side to side and say, okay, there is Putin, but at the same time we're going to decrease spending. So I just wanted to have a clarification on that.
Great. One more question?
Yeah, long time no see. Hi, Dr. Kuznick. My question is actually, how I know that you mentioned the event that happened in Shanghai, and I think I remember Kim Jong-un also being in there, I think. But I also just wanted to ask how, with the new involvement of North Korea and they're going into China and Russia and all that stuff, I wonder how they will play a big role in the new Cold War. Thank you.
Great. I think we've just got time for Dr. Kuznick to touch on the wide array of very good questions. I don't know if we can do that in 10 minutes, but if anyone can, you can. So.
Well, I wanted to start, Rusty made me think of something that I didn't have time to say. In 2019, Jimmy Carter gave a sermon at his church in Plains, Georgia. And he told the congregation that just the night before he had gotten a phone call from Donald Trump. And he said, Trump was very concerned about the China century. And Jimmy Carter said to him, he told the congregation, I'm not at all concerned about the China century. He said, since 1979, do you know how many times China has been at war with anybody? He asked the congregation, and he said, none. And we've stayed at war. He said, the United States in its 242 years, Jimmy Carter said, has only known 16 years of peace. He says, the U.S. is the most warlike nation in the history of the world. And then he goes on, he says, we force our principles on others. How many miles of high-speed railroad do we have in this country? He says, China has built 18,000 miles of high-speed rail, while the U.S. has wasted, he says, I think, $3 trillion on military spending. It's more than you can imagine. China has not wasted a single penny on war, and that's why they're ahead of us in almost every way. If you take $3 trillion and put it in American infrastructure, you probably have $2 trillion left over. We'd have high-speed railroad, we'd have bridges that aren't collapsing, we'd have roads that are maintained properly. Our education system would be as good as that of, say, South Korea or Hong Kong. The reality was we spent $8 trillion on our forever wars, according to the Costs of War project at Brown University. So I think that Jimmy Carter has a very, very important point to make, which really addresses one of the later questions also. I'll get to the question of what can students do last. Military spending. Why does the United States spend so much on its military and take it out? You know, Rusty was saying we're going to cut the food programs so that we can spend more on the military. We see the same thing happening in Europe now. Taiwan, which the U.S. is like a protection racket, according to Trump. He says he wants them to not only invest massively in the U.S., but to spend 10% of their GDP on their militaries. We've gone a long time without a direct war between the U.S. and Russia, or the Soviet Union before that. And what happens is when you have a treaty that works or you have a program that works, it's got to be in everybody's mutual interest. It is as much in Russia's interest to have a peaceful world that allows for Russian development as it is in America's interest. So what kind of treaty can we craft in Ukraine that'll represent some of Ukraine's interest, some of Russia's interest, some of the European interest? Are we smart enough to figure that out? How to do that? Part of that deal has got to be a massive rebuilding of Ukraine. I mean, that country is devastated. Just as we need a massive rebuilding of Gaza that the world's going to have to kick in for. But that's the basis on which we can settle some of these issues. And I thought we were getting close on Ukraine. After Trump and Putin met in Alaska, everybody mocked Trump for rolling out the red carpet there and embracing Putin. But effectively, what the U.S. is saying is that the 20% that Russia controls of Ukraine is going to stay part of Russia. Crimea is going to stay part of Russia. Ukraine is not going to join NATO, but we now need to figure out what kind of security architecture works. I've been proposing from the beginning that China and India and parts of the third world, do you know who contributes the most of all the 5 Security Council members? Which one contributes the most to UN peacekeeping missions? China contributes more to UN peacekeeping missions than the other 4 Security Council members combined. India is also way up there. So Putin has said, no NATO troops in Ukraine. We could still have peacekeeping measures that can give Ukraine some security. And you know, this question of Russian expansionism, Putin has said that anybody who doesn't miss the Soviet Union has no heart. Anybody who wants to recreate the Soviet Union has no brain. You know, Russia has taken them 3.5 years to get 20% of Ukraine, which many people thought they were going to do in the first weekend. They don't want a war with Europe. Putin doesn't need to expand. You know how much territory? The first time I went to Russia, I was in South Sakhalin, and I had to fly to Moscow. It was 8 time zones to get from Sakhalin to Moscow. Do you know how big Russia is? They could take all those climate refugees we're going to see from all over the world and help repopulate Russia. They don't need more territory. They need people to actually develop what they've got already in terms of land and resources. Second question about, so why do we do that? Why do we spend so much on our military? One of the reasons is that Eisenhower identified as the military-industrial complex has had an inordinate influence in U.S. life. And Eisenhower warned about that in his farewell speech in 1961. And sadly, that's the only thing most students know about Eisenhower, which is better than knowing some of the other stuff, but it's not all there was to Eisenhower. Eisenhower knew that because he created the military-industrial complex. When he took office, the U.S. had about 1,000 nuclear weapons. When he left office, the U.S. had more than 22,000 nuclear weapons. When his budgeting cycle was finished, the U.S. had 30,000 nuclear weapons. I could go on, but I don't have time. So there's a lot of profit to be made. And those people, what you have are people who are going from generals to the government to being the heads of these defense contractors, they call them. In the 1930s, you know what we called them? Merchants of death. And there was a bill introduced in mid-1930s to cut out every penny of profit from the military sector, the military contractors, if the U.S. gets into a war. To think of the immorality of these people making millions and billions of dollars off people dying, off people getting wounded, off people losing their arms and legs, or even worse, their genitals, you know, is so obscene to me that they do that. But that's who they are, and their influence in the Trump administration, the Biden administration, every administration is, again, excessive, very, very excessive. Question about the domino theory. The domino theory didn't work. If you look at much of Asia now, they thought that it was going to lead ultimately to the communist takeover in Japan, or Australia, or New Zealand, or Thailand. I mean, you go right down the list. The last I checked, Ishiba in Japan is not a communist. The LDP, which the CIA set up in the 1950s, has dominated Japan ever since. There was briefly a democratic government led by my friend Hatoyama, who I co-authored a book with. And then Obama came in and smashed him over the US troops in Okinawa. So no, the domino theory didn't work, and there's no more truth to that now than there is now. AU versus GW. I think we could kick their butts in basketball this year. But during the Gaza protests, all the campuses in the Washington area, all the students converged on George Washington's campus, and that's where they held all of the rallies. So, you know, American University, I'm proud to say, would get voted year after year by the Princeton Review as the most political campus in America, the most politically active campus in America. But I would tell students that the definition that they use of political activism is not the definition that we would use coming from the 1960s and 70s. I mean, these students are doing internships, they're involved with the Democratic and Republican parties, mostly Democrats. There are very few conservatives at American University. But I welcome them always into my class, and I urge them and I protect them from the more liberal left students. But the military in the streets in Washington is pretty frightening. I mean, it smells of fascism, and it's trying to get the Americans used to that kind of Marines in the streets in Los Angeles. Now he's threatening Chicago. The extreme weather. Extreme weather is certainly a reality, but it's one that you can all experience just day to day with the hurricanes and the global warming. The effect that it's having, large parts of China and India will soon be uninhabitable. Much of the globe will be uninhabitable. We saw the effect that 1 million refugees from Syria and Afghanistan had in Europe. It led to the rise of these right-wing parties in Europe and these strong anti-immigrant movements and actual fascist parties taking power or influence in much of Europe from 1 million refugees. There are going to be tens of millions, scores of millions of climate refugees later this century in your lifetime. And it's going to wreak havoc on the globe because things are progressing at such a rapid pace. And we see that also even in terms of America's military bases. Many of the naval bases are soon going to be underwater. Parts of, I knew a top Homeland Security official, this was back in the Biden administration, and I said something there about what are we going to do? She said, move away from the coasts. You know, we've seen signs of that already in New York. We see it in Japan. I see it everywhere, that the climate change is going to change people's lives, and it's real, and it's happening at a faster pace, and all the climate scientists are unanimous, except for a handful of kooks who Trump trusts instead of the climate scientists. And what he said at the UN was such an embarrassment and so dangerous to the world, among other things. Your NATO spending, one fellow suggested that Putin won't stop if he takes Ukraine. I don't think there's any logic to that. I think Putin is not going to keep going. I speak to the Russian people. I was just there for the Moscow International Film Festival. I chaired the documentary jury at the Moscow International Film Festival. I denounced the invasion on live TV all over Russia at the film festival. But it's clear that the Russians have no appetite. Putin's approval ratings are still in the 70%, but they don't like this war. Many of them are opposed on principle. Others are just tired of it. They want it to end. When I said the war has to end now, the invasion has to end, and I called it an invasion, I got tremendous applause. I felt like I was Jimmy Kimmel getting the applause. And so the Russian people don't want that any more than the Americans want to see the U.S. involved in endless wars. Something about North Korea. I mean, North Korea is a bizarre country. I'm the first to admit that. Since I'm a strong advocate of democracy, I don't like the lack of democracy in Russia, China, North Korea, or the United States. This troubles me deeply. And I say when I do my interviews in all those countries, so I don't do many in North Korea, but I do a lot in Russia and China, and I say that the strength of a nation is the people who dissent. That if I were the head of Russia's government, I wouldn't shut down dissent, I would welcome it. I would encourage it. What is Putin afraid of? What is Xi Jinping afraid of? What is Trump afraid of? This is what makes a country strong and vibrant and creative and gives the ideas for finding alternatives to make people's lives better. So the question of what can we do? And Rusty knows it's not an easy one. But she wrote about Vietnam, a brilliant book about Vietnam, in which she shows that it was really in large part, the American public opposition that forced the end to the war. It was when Nixon took over with these plans for massively increasing the U.S. involvement and even using nuclear weapons, that it was the protests in October, November of 1969 that forced him to drop his plans. And we saw that that's what forced the governments to end the war, to respond to we didn't know that at the time. We thought we were having no impact. We were going to these marches and chanting, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Or LBJ, pull out like your father should have, but we didn't know what impact we were having.
I didn't shout that. I'm just
Don't use that one.
Well, I did. I did. Rusty was too genteel. So you never know. But we saw how ABC and Disney backed down because there was popular outcry against censoring Jimmy Kimmel for what he said. But we see universities cave in. A professor just recently got fired at Texas A&M for talking about gender in class. We've got a certain, security at our stage of our career, but young professors are running scared about what they're allowed to talk about and not talk about. And that's very, very dangerous for our country. But you've got to use every avenue you have, whether it's your friends online, whether it's access to the media, whether it's demonstrations, whether it's writing letters to Congress people, or any other way, calling up these television stations. They listen to your voices more than they listen to ours very often, because they represent a whole generation. And your generation, I see with my students at least, is very radicalized in certain ways. And very anti-war, very concerned about climate issues, very concerned about gender issues, and need to be heard from, because this is the world that you're inheriting, and you can make it a great world, make it live up to its promise, or it can turn into a fascist dystopia. And it's really up to all of us to do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen.
Wow, that's really the perfect conclusion, isn't it? Political fitness on all of those levels in all of those ways. Sorry we don't have more time to really mine the wonderful insights historically, politically, and culturally that our speaker today has shared with us, and of course, as well as Professor Eisenberg. So thanks again to all of you for coming, for your good questions. Remember October 30th for Ambassador Fergal-Mithen, as well as Day of Dialogue on October 21st, and Indigenous Peoples Day on the 14th of October. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our guests.
Thank you. Thank you.